Good afternoon, and my name is Devajyotida. I'm here to present the paper which is titled as The Plague and the Bard, the Legacy of William Shakespeare. Now, usually when we talk about disease, what comes to our mind is death and destruction. But with Shakespeare, like everything else, he is someone who begins at a very different way in looking into the Renaissance thinking. Now, disease for him is what begins his creation rather than something which ends it. Now, when we look at plays like King Lear, which is written during the time of the Great Plague in London, what comes to our first in front of our ears and eyes are how the etymological nuances of diseased has become names. For instance, the name gonorrhea is a linguistic formation and etymological sequentiality of the term gonorrhea. So when Lear says, "Thou art a boil, a plague, sore and embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood," is something that talks about a venereal disease. And Lear is referring macrocosmically to the epidemic that was happening there, smallpox, and also microcosmically to the human relationships. As I have said, the frequency of disease in England finds repeated utterances in many Shakespearean plays, either literally or metaphorically. Thus, J.M.W. Bean writes in his essay, Plague, Population and Economic Decline in England in the Later Middle Age, that what Black Death did in 1348 and what Great Plague of London did in 1665, it's a connection that is formed. So we are connected by the pan-vulnerability of a diseased existence. And death is something that connects all of us. This movement from eros to necros, and from necros to back to eros, is what Shakespearean universe assumes to bring forward. And this Shakespearean idea of plague, as he understood, is showing the hologrammatic fallacy of biotic supremacy of capitalism. Now, the diseased carcass, which is a non-recyclable biohazard, is something that comes back to us in 2020 when we are studying pandemic. And the connection of this pan-vulnerability through ages has taught us something, that disease is something which is definitely scary and definitely catastrophic. It has a necroplasm to it rather than a phytoplasm, but that connection need not to make us get into a layer of depreciative monotony of existence. Now, if we see that human bubonic plague to pneumonic plague, both that was there in the Shakespearean time, ravages through the plague basilicus, and it attacks the lymphatic gland system in case of the bubonic plague, and in case of pneumonic plague, it directly attacks the lungs. And what remains is the episteme of death. So in the post-Anthropocene era of plague and death, Shakespeare's Hamlet and King Lear belongs to the threshold values where Renaissance humanism of Vertuvian man becomes a decentered cogito. Shakespeare in his plays present the quality of ambiguity and disorientation that occurs in the middle stage of ritualistic conversion from human to subhuman and finally to post-human, where participants no longer hold their pre-ritual status but have not yet began the transition to the status they will hold when the ritual is complete. Eliot has also spoken about this series of dead bodies floating in Thames, right, in his wasteland. So the idea of dead bodies has connected generations of literary artists. Lear and Tom, the Bedlam beggar, are in the disguise, that is, are between their previous way of structuring their identity, time, or community in a new way, which is established by the rituals. Now, the geometric punctum of play created the basilica of Shakespearean world, which steps out of Elizabethan England in time and space when we are confronted by the pandemic of COVID-19 in the year 2020. As an infant, Shakespeare was confronted with the catastrophic loss of structured identity. When bubonic plague created the post-Anthropocene England. The existential threat that survived time and affected his writings and the play King Lear produced the post-traumatic upheaval as we are placed in the blasted heath with storm raging. And Hamlet's diseased world takes us in the heart of Foucauldian biopolitics, where necros dominate as the eros fades. The post-apocalyptic storm scene shows Lear's microcosmic trauma and the macrocosmic trauma of audience who lived through the plague, whereas Ophelia and Lear's madness reveal the post-traumatic stress disorder. Edgar and Hamlet's feigned madness are symptomatic mock illness that contrasts the failure of memory for Eliot and for Ophelia and Lear. Thus, Jerome Mazzaro writes in his essay Madness and Memory, Shakespeare's Hamlet and King Lear, to quote, "The mental states of Ophelia and Lear reveals not only how much Simonidian memory system based on our correspondences between a microcosm and macrocosm has taken roots, but also how by possessing an intermediary ordering reference point is in a demicosm, a basis for worldly or human understanding." Now, when we are looking into this Renaissance text through the lenses of 2020, 21, and now 2025, what we see is medicinal humanity. Now, post-humanism has various structural nuances: mathematical humanities, blue humanities, plant humanities. One of them is a medicinal humanity. Now, when we study the medicinal humanity, we can understand and locate the bionic materialism of a disease. Thus, if we see the genome structure of the bubonic plague, it is RNA genome structure, just like what happened during coronavirus. In coronavirus, we have in RNA genome structure, we have a rep L but 1A and rep L 1B. But in case of bubonic plague, it was just rep 1LA, 1A. And in case of pneumonic plague, it has become rep 1B. The difference is that replication of protein. which is S structural protein. S structural protein is something that it was there in bubonic plague, but in E envelope protein gene, which is developed form of bubonic plague, that is pneumonic plague, and M membrane protein gene with N nucleocapsid gene, the genome structure brings us very close to the RNA genome structure of COVID virus. In COVID, we have the PROM protector and ORF in an open reading frame. The virus diameter, that is in COVID, is 120 nm. In case of bubonic plague, it was 80 nm. In case of pneumonic plague, it was 100 nm. In case of bubonic plague, we have a lipid bilayer. In case of pneumonic, it is lipid trilayer, and in case of pandemic through COVID, we have lipid bilayer. And in all of them, the core RNA genome is present. The envelope made up of lipid bilayer has a membrane, envelope and anchored spike protein. Now this is what the problem is, the spike protein. That is why it resists cure. Now if you know what is spike protein, right? Spike protein is something that stops the white blood cell from curing the disease. Something that was there in our cancerous cells. Like the white blood cell thinks that the cancerous cells are good, and therefore they accept the cancerous cells and does not understand how it has eroded, or when it has done the erosion, the white blood cell could not stop it because it haven't seen it as a threat. So this is what the spike protein does. In case of spike protein, what happens is the white blood cell assumes that it is completely safe, and that is why it is so difficult to cure COVID. It is actually not curable yet. There is a vaccine for that, and similarly it's quite same with pneumonic plague. So why the RNA genome is so dangerous? Because it's bound by the nucleocapsid protein. There is a nucleocapsid protein layer that stops the cure from getting into your blood cells. Now what happens is the S protein, which is so important, is homotrimeric in structure with S1 and S2 subunits. The S1 subunit functions as a receptor binding domain, while S2 forms the stalk of the spike. So S2 is something that happened during the pneumonic plague, and S1 was something that happened due to the bubonic plague. In case of COVID, we have both S1 and S2, and collectively both protein helps in viron host cell receptor binding, and this is the reason there is still no cure for it. So coming out of the medicinal terminology, back to the Renaissance humanism. Body is a textuality within the space of biopolitical cartography of pandemic, epidemic, disease and medicine. Care, cure, creating a therapeutic balance in the hospital space which makes illness bind us to time and space. From Hamlet's odor of mortality to the odor of dead carcasses standing in queue to be disposed of as a biohazard during COVID-19, what becomes a legacy is disease as a verb and as a noun. Richard D. Altec thus correctly positions Hamlet in his essay Hamlet and the Odor of Mortality. And I quote from the famous first statement of the idea in Marcellus, "Something is rotten in the state of Denmark," to Hamlet's discourse with the gravediggers on the lamentable condition of the bodies they disinter. The reader of the play may never forget that after death, human body putrefies, becomes a biohazard. That flesh was foul, and even a king could go on this progress through the guts of a beggar. So the and in my quote, the phenomenological distance between body and illness correct our subjectivism, and what is cured is not healed, and what the healing process ensure is not cure. The logic of medicinal humanities tries the dissemination of healthy and cured body in the praxis of anatomical epistemology. Hamlet and Lear makes approach the logos of disease from two opposite sides. Lear from the diseased and Hamlet from the gaze of doctor, pretending to be the patient. And they meet the audience from a post-human route to gaze. Thus Foucault aptly writes, and I quote, "For us, human body defines by natural right the space of origin, of distribution of disease, a space whose lines, volumes, surfaces and roots are laid down in accordance with a now familiar geometry by the anatomical atlas. But this order of the solid visible body is not only one way. In all likelihood, neither the first nor the fundamental in which one spatializes disease. There have been and will be other distribution of illness," as Foucault writes in his Birth of Clinic. This definition by Foucault brings us right at the nerve center of the present moment of mistreatment in the clinics and the resultant trauma. The hospital gaze of Hamlet has underlined the destructive causality and casuality in the Ophelia's psychological space, and our existence in and out of the clinic traumatized many of us beyond repair. The careful gaze of Hamlets, that is, there are Hamlets in our world, and the empirical vigilance in the hospital suspended the Lears, that is the diseased man, and Ophelias, that is the diseased women, in a convalescent limbo of psychological and social discourse. Thank you so much for listening patiently to my paper, and it's being it's a very interesting discussion that I entered, and there is a sociological impact, medicinal impact of the humanities, and when we are looking into Shakespeare, we should not only look into it as an emblematic to what the that means the adaptation. We should not look at to it just from one dimension of adaptation. Shakespearean plays are not only adapted from stage to page to films to Bollywoods to Hollywoods or even to Tollywoods. The adaptation, when we are talking about Shakespeare adaptation, we have to remember the adaptation of disease, adaptation of thematic, and the nuances of pan-vulnerability is also adapted even out of the stage into our life. And Shakespeare is not just only for television or for sitcoms or for large stages. And because Shakespeare has found that life is a stage and we are merely players, right? And so when we are since this is a seminar about Shakespeare adaptation, we should remember that it's not only adapted and adopted into various languages. The plays have various local nuances, but the idea of the disease and pan-vulnerability, which was there in the Renaissance humanism, it was there in the Elizabethan period, is also here in our present condition. Thank you so much.